Welcome. Thank you for joining me once again as we walk through the Gospel of Matthew. Today we have a particularly interesting message, a little more personal message dealing with Jesus and his disciples. And there's a little internal strife going on, so let's look into that and see if we can learn anything. The right and the left, Matthew 20, verses 20 through 28. Then the mother of Zebedee's sons came to Jesus with her sons, and kneeling down, asked a favor of him. "What is it you want?" he asked. She said, "Grant that one of these two sons of mine may sit at your right, and the other at your left in your kingdom." "You don't know what you are asking," Jesus said to them. "Can you drink the cup I am going to drink?" "We can," they answered. Jesus said to them, You will indeed drink from the cup, but to sit at my right or my left is not for me to grant. These places belong to those for whom they have been prepared by my Father." When the 10 heard about this, they were indignant with the two brothers. Jesus called them together and said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." Interesting little section here. What's clear is the disciples still think the kingdom is going to be an earthly one. They think Jesus is about to establish an earthly kingdom of God, of Yahweh. And they're vying, sort of jockeying for position and who's going to be the most powerful in this kingdom. Jesus is obviously going to be the king. But the question remains, who's going to be at the right and the left? What's going to be the pecking order in this group? And since the 12 are his closest, they're wanting to establish, who's who in the next political, administration. Who's going to be the Secretary of Defense? Who's going to be the treasurer? So there's a lot of you can just tell they're still anticipating an earthly kingdom and are trying to fit into that picture. What's interesting is Peter, James, and John are obviously form the inner circle of Jesus. When he goes up on the mountain, he takes only those three. He takes those three several times when he wants to pray. So it's clear when the mother of James and John asks that they can sit at the right or to the left of Jesus, that they're not worried about the other disciples. I think they're worried about, I think Peter is the one that they're actually concerned about. He's the competition. There's two spots, a right and a left, and there's three on the inner circle. Obviously, the two brothers are trying to make sure their status is cemented in, and that Peter ends up number 4, since Peter is such a dominant figure in this group. You don't know what you're asking. I think that's a fascinating comment. The disciples sense the time's coming for the kingdom. They feel as Jesus turns towards Jerusalem, they can just tell his demeanor, something about his energy, something about the way he is focused on moving towards Jerusalem for the Passover. That this is it, that the day is finally coming. And so they're thinking, now is the time. We've got to make our move now to ensure our positions in the kingdom. And you can tell, I imagine all of them have been talking about it. You can sort of see the anticipation as several times they've tried to make him king, and he wouldn't let them. And so they feel like now is finally the time. So they're really trying to solidify their positions in the coming kingdom. And you kind of wonder, what was Jesus thinking when he made the statement above that he said, "You don't know what you're asking"? He knew that they didn't understand the kind of kingdom he was going to establish. He knew they didn't even get the principles of this new kingdom and how different they were going to be than the worldly kingdoms. They had no idea what they were actually in for. But they were still following Jesus, and they were committed to following Jesus. But they still didn't have a clear picture of what was about to happen. And then there's the next question. Can you drink the cup I am going to drink? I mean, what a great question. They had no idea what they were doing. They had no idea what was coming, and yet they were so adamant that they could. Oh, yes, we can. They were letting Jesus know, we're with you all the way, even though they had no idea where all the way was going to take them. And of course, I imagine in the days to come, James and John reflected back on this question. Can you drink the cup I'm going to drink? They both drank deeply from the cup that Jesus drank. I've always been fascinated with the fact that they're asking for the positions on the right and the left of Jesus. And if you know the history of the scriptures, you know that the first of the 12 that was killed was James. And John was the last apostle standing. He was the last one alive. And that somehow they did form the right and the left of Jesus in a life of sacrifice and service and ultimate martyrdom. But who does the kingdom belong to? The kingdom of heaven belongs to God, the Father, as Jesus said, to Yahweh. And only Yahweh has the authority to assign seating in the coming kingdom of heaven. God is in charge. And Jesus, throughout his ministry, constantly points to that he recognizes he is the Messiah, he is the coming king, but that his Father has given him all authority, that his Father is in charge, that he says nothing without his Father telling him what to say. Jesus shows his obedience to God as an example for us to show our obedience to God and to Jesus as well. And by the way, you will indeed drink from the cup. James and John were both persecuted. John, since he lived so long, went through many persecutions, whereas James, relatively short life after that, was one of the first martyrs certainly of the 12. So what were the other 10 thinking when this happened? When they find out James and John are trying to jockey for the top 2 positions, what do you think they were thinking about? When the 10 heard about this, they were indignant with the 2 brothers. And of course, my question is, do you think that was righteous indignation? Do you think they were appalled that James and John would think in such political terms? I have a sneaking suspicion they're indignant because they were thinking the same thing, and that James and John just beat them to it. And we have this problem today. It's a human nature problem, that it's still very much with us today. You deal with most church problems that I'm familiar with, most conflicts between ministers and elders, conflicts between missionaries on the mission field, is a power struggle, the turf wars within a congregation or within a group of people trying to work together. I've always been bothered by the statistic that one of the main reasons missionaries return from the mission field before they're supposed to is that they can't get along with the other missionaries. There's always this human nature power struggle, this talking of my work or my church or my area of expertise, my authority, and we seem to forget the words of Jesus so easily, even when we're struggling with power struggles. We need to understand the church is not a business. I know a lot of people think of the church in those terms, but the fact is it's just not that kind of organization. It is an organism. It is a living body of Jesus Christ. You see, businesses use people to draw in money, whereas churches use money to draw in people. Churches are in the people business, not in the money business. Unfortunately, there are quite a number of churches that appear to be in the money business rather than the people business. But the fact of the matter is there's just 2 opposing worldviews that these 2 different organizations go from, and we need to understand that. We need to not see the church as a business. And I've heard people talk about it like that, and it bothers me that the church is just a business, and evangelism is really the marketing or the sales, and You're like, no, the Bible says one plants, one waters, God gives the increase. And so as Jesus talks to his disciples there, he's trying to get them to understand this is not a worldly organization. This is not a worldly political structure. And he reminds them, he says, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them. Anytime you said something about the Gentiles in a Jewish crowd, you knew that whatever the Gentiles were doing was bad. And so he reminds them, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. That's what they do. He's letting his apostles know that's not what we do. That's what they do. And what they're doing is wrong. And just in case they miss the point, he says, not so with you. The people who claim to follow me cannot be like this. And that's a pretty, you don't have to be a theologian to understand this. What's unfortunate is too often human nature asserts itself even in Christian organizations. And too often you have Christians trying to lord it over others and exercise authority over others instead of listening to the words of Jesus. You see, the kingdom of heaven is an upside-down kingdom. And Jesus hammers that point home when he says, whoever wants to be great among you must be your servant. Guessing that's not what the apostles wanted to hear. Whoever wants to be first must be your slave. Now they were looking for political power. They were looking to have authority. They wanted to be the guys in charge. They wanted to throw the Romans out and be able to order people around the way the Romans did. And Jesus says, no, we're not setting up that kind of a kingdom. In our kingdom, the great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must become your slave. Jesus is telling them that we do things differently in the kingdom of heaven. And here's the catch. If we want to be a part of the we that Jesus is talking about, then we have to do things differently. We have to do things the way Jesus showed us, a life of sacrifice. So what's our call to action today? Jesus tells them, the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, to give his life as a ransom for many. It should make the call to action pretty clear. We're called to sacrificial service for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. We're called to live a life of service and servitude. We're called to sacrifice ourselves so that the kingdom will grow, that God's name will be glorified. That's what we're called to do. Sacrificial service is literally how you gain spiritual authority. It's when people see that sacrificial spirit that they want to follow you. They want to be inspired by you. And in the kingdom of heaven, in the church, we inspire people by lives of sacrificial service, not by lording authority over each other like so many human organizations do. We're called to give up our lives for God and others in order to gain life eternal status with God. That's what we're called to do. The question is, can we live up to that call? I pray this week you will do so. In some way, shape, or form, live a life of service so that God's name is glorified. Thank you for joining me today.